The moon lightly illuminated the room, casting ghostly shadows on the old wooden walls. Harold sat on the edge of the bed, silent and full of thoughts. Next to him was a young girl whose eyes were misty and whose face glowed with a rare, almost innocent expression of happiness. Their connection seemed so unnatural that, in another situation, it would have caused surprise and judgment. But these two found something in each other, something that no one else could understand. Clara, a 19-year-old girl, sought to find in Harold not just a man, but an opportunity to escape the confines of her small town. She had always been interested in something more than mundane things, and she would take pictures of deserted landscapes and ruined buildings because she felt like them, lost and empty. She was drawn to people with difficult lives, people who could give her something new, something she hadn't known before. Harold, a loner with a dark look in his eyes, obviously weighed down by the burdens of life, was the perfect target for her curiosity. Harold had only appeared in the town a few years ago. People knew he had served, but no one knew where, with whom, or why. He had decided to spend the last years of his life in this quiet corner of New Mexico. He had once had a family. Some of his neighbors knew that. His wife and son had been killed in an accident decades earlier, and since then, Harold had turned into a man who was always there for others, but never opened up to anyone. He learned to be silent, learned to hide his pain under a mask of indifference, and became a hermit, almost invisible to the locals. Clara lived with her parents and younger brother. Her family was typical of a small town. Her father worked at the post office, and her mother ran a small shop selling souvenirs for tourists who sometimes stopped by. Simple joys, family celebrations, and loyalty to established traditions were important to them, and they made Clara bored. Her mother was caring, but she also limited her freedom because she wanted her daughter to live an ordinary life that would protect her from the dangers of the outside world. Her father was calm and unobtrusive, and her younger brother, always cheerful, did not share her deep inner search and looked at life simply. One hot day, Clara was wandering around the outskirts of the town, looking for new angles for her photographs. She came to an old, abandoned house where the ruined roof seemed to rise above time. It was there that she first saw Harold. He was standing next to the abandoned door, silently looking up at the sky. His posture was strong, and his eyes, hidden under a wide hat, seemed penetrating and a little scary. Clara was surprised. At first glance, he was an ordinary old man, but there was something unusual, something magnetic about him. They started talking. At first he was silent, letting Clara talk about her passion for photography. He was interested in her ambitions, but she noticed that his eyes never showed emotion. Gradually, she learned a little more about his lonely life, the war, and past losses, although Harold never spoke directly. The conversations brought them closer together, as if they were two conspirators who shared what others could not understand. After that meeting, Clara returned to that spot again and again. She would take her camera, ostensibly to take pictures of the old house, but in reality she was drawn to the possibility of seeing Harold. Her gaze, full of naivety and curiosity, touched his tired eyes. He began to feel a strange relief in her presence, something he hadn't felt in a long time. In each of their conversations, Clara grew closer to him, awakening memories that Harold had buried many years ago. Clara would bring him photographs, pictures of nature, desert landscapes where it seemed possible to forget the rest of the world. Harold listened with rapt attention to her explanations of how she found beauty in the smallest details, in a shadow, in the angle of light, in the curve of a stone. For him, she became like a canvas on which he saw the reflection of his youth. And in this silence, in the exchange of glances, something that could be called not just friendship, but something deeper emerged between them, although neither of them said it out loud. Their connection, strange, incomprehensible, but tangible, acquired new shades. Each of their meetings became longer, and each conversation deeper. She brought him a part of youth, light, and inspiration, and he gave her mystery and a sense of danger that Clara had always lacked. A warm summer evening enveloped the small town with a light smell of dust and dry grass. Clara walked through the park, slowly reflecting on her day and looking at the outlines of the trees swaying against the fading sky. Among the muffled shadows, She suddenly saw a familiar figure, lonely and motionless. Harold was sitting on an old bench, staring up at the sky. His dark silhouette was reflected against the sky, which was tinged with orange and purple. He sat absolutely still, arms crossed over his chest, as if in deep thought. Clara slowed her pace, trying not to break his silence, but something in his posture caught her attention. It seemed that he was not just looking up at the sky, but as if he was searching for something there, perhaps an answer to unspoken questions. "Do you often sit here?" Clara asked cautiously, trying not to scare him. Harold turned around slowly. His face, shrouded in the evening shadows, was heavy, as if it bore the weight of all the years that had passed. But when he saw her, the corners of his lips lifted slightly in a slight smile. "Sometimes," he said briefly. "It's a peaceful place. Sometimes you just want to look at the sky." His voice was low, a little hoarse, like a man who hadn't spoken to others in a long time. Clara could tell that he was genuinely happy to see her, though he might not have realized it. "What do you see up there?" she asked, sitting down on the bench next to him. Harold thought for a moment. "Nothing much," he answered slowly. "Just the stars. They're always there, even when you can't see them." Clara smiled, but there was a slight look of thought in her eyes. "You know, sometimes I think that everything here in the town has been predetermined for a long time. Wherever I go, it seems that I already know what will happen next. But—" She paused for a second, wondering if she should continue. "Everything changes when I take my camera. Then I can see the world differently," she finished quietly. Harold listened carefully to her words, nodding as if he understood. "That's important," he said. "There are many things in the world that you don't notice if you look at them superficially. I've always believed that true vision comes with experience." Clara looked at him thoughtfully, impressed by how well he understood her words. At 19 years old, she often felt as if her dreams and desires seemed too naive or ridiculous to others. But Harold listened to her with such genuine interest as no one else had ever done before. "I feel like a stranger here," she suddenly confessed. "Like this town. Like this place doesn't accept me." Harold tilted his head a little and gave her a long, thoughtful look. "Every place," he said slowly, "leaves its marks on us. Sometimes it is not what we would like, but the trace remains. Sometimes we want to run away from it, but it's not always possible." Clara was silent. His words had a deep meaning that she felt but could not fully understand. An uneasy feeling stirred in her heart, but at the same time she felt that for the first time in a long time, someone really understood her, even though they were talking about such abstract things. After that meeting in the park, their conversations became regular. They began meeting in the evenings, when the town was already falling asleep, and only a few street lamps illuminated the paths in the park. Her parents did not ask where she was. They were used to her long walks with her camera. Clara enjoyed these encounters, finding something in them that she could not find among her peers, a depth, a quiet comfort, an understanding without words. Harold became something of a mentor to her, although they rarely spoke directly about her life. He gave advice so naturally that it seemed more like hints, pushing her to draw her own conclusions. She told him about her photographs, the places she dreamed of seeing, and even her fear of the limitations her small town imposed on her. One evening, when the conversation became particularly frank, Clara confessed, "Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck in a spider's web, as if my desires and aspirations are just an illusion because I can never leave this place. I'm too dependent on what's here family, people who know me." Harold listened to her, leaning forward a little, his eyes serious. "People often create cages around themselves," he said, "but the cage is not always locked. Sometimes we're just afraid to open the door." Her heart beat faster. She felt the subconscious desire to escape to somewhere far away grow stronger. His words resonated deep in her soul, as if he were showing her the way out, but at the same time warning her of something she could not yet realize. "Have you ever wanted to leave this town?" she asked suddenly, feeling that this question was more important than it seemed at first glance. Harold was silent for a moment, his gaze resting on the sky again, as it had been during their first meeting. Finally, he answered quietly, There were times when I wanted to keep many things, but sometimes," he held his breath, "running away doesn't solve problems. There are things that follow you wherever you go." Clara didn't know what he was talking about, but she felt that these words carried a personal story, unknown to her. Perhaps he was also dreaming of freedom that he had not found, or simply coming to terms with the secrets he had left in his past. She looked at him with a strange sense of respect and a little envy. The evening was coming to an end, and they silently got up from the bench. Now their conversations had a new level, more intimate, deeper, where words were not the only means of expression. Clara felt that every time they met, it gave her confidence, but at the same time made her look at the world in a new way, a little scared. Harold became her mentor in how to see the world in a non-obvious way, through the prism of details that most people would never notice. He used to say that the truth is hidden in the smallest details, and Clara, absorbing his words, learned to look at the world with a new sensitivity. One day, while walking with her, Harold stopped at an old, abandoned station that Clara often photographed. He took her camera and, holding it out to her, said, "Look not at the station, but at its shadows. Imagine how these shadows could change over time. Who passed through here? What traces were left on these walls?" Clara looked through the lens, trying to imagine what he was describing. With his gaze, Harold opened a new dimension for her. She realized that her photographs could convey not only images, but also feelings that would remind her of the past, of stories she didn't know yet, but that could have lived in those places. Sometimes it seemed to her that Harold was talking not only about the abandoned buildings, but also about himself, about his shadows, and the past that remained hidden behind his eyes. With each meeting, Harold revealed himself a little more, although he did so as if involuntarily, unintentionally. Sometimes he began to tell her about his youth, when he was still full of energy, and the same fire burned in him that was now burning in Clara. His eyes would take on a strange sparkle as he recalled his years of military service, when he felt invulnerable and strong. However, there was always something heavy and depressing in these stories, and Clara felt that he was not telling her the whole truth. One day, as the evening twilight enveloped their conversation, Harold said something that made her freeze. "War changes people. It makes them different. You see in it not only death, but also something else. Something you will never see in peaceful life. And this other thing stays with you forever." Clara tried to ask him more, but he remained silent, staring at the shadows that enveloped their bench. A sense of tension hung in the air. She didn't know what he had been through, but she sensed that it was something so dark that even he would prefer not to remember it. She was curious about his past, and it drew her to him even more. But she couldn't explain to herself why she was drawn to those stories. His past seemed alien, incomprehensible, but at the same time she felt that it was the only place where he found meaning and something real. More and more often, Clara began to realize that this connection went beyond ordinary friendship. Every time she returned home after meeting with Harold, there was an imprint of something elusive but extremely strong in her soul. She thought about him, about their conversations, about his memories, which seemed alien but at the same time so real. He was her bridge to something she could never find among her peers. One day, she brought him one of her favorite photographs, an old bridge under a thick fog. It seemed to her that this photo accurately reflected her thoughts and feelings, a fragile, forgotten, but still existing bridge leading somewhere into the unknown. Harold looked at the photo for a long time and suddenly spoke. "You know, I used to have a bridge like that too, between me and my family. An accident." He stopped, his voice cold and hard, "destroyed everything I had. And since then, I have not been able to return, not to people, not to myself." Clara felt a wave of pity and fear wash over her. Her interest in him was mixed with the realization that his burden was too great, that perhaps this man was not just a recluse, but a man who had been unable to leave behind the shadows of the past. He continued to live among his ghosts, and she felt that these ghosts were becoming more and more real to her. "Sometimes people think they can change the past," he said quietly, looking away from the photograph. "But all they can do is accept it and not let it destroy what's left." She felt that his words were addressed to her as a warning, as a hint, so that she would not get too close to his dark memories, which could pull her in like deep waters. But at the same time, she couldn't let go of this closeness that seemed so alluring and dangerous at the same time. The more Clara spent time with Harold, the more she felt herself changing. Her view of the world, of people, even of her own life, gradually changed. She no longer saw things the way she used to. Her thoughts became deeper, more burdened, as if the shadows of Harold's stories haunted her even in her dreams. Harold taught her to see the world through the prism of the past, to see every object not just as an image, but as a memory, as a story hidden in the details. He told her that beauty is often hidden in the darkest places, and that only those who dare to look into this darkness can discover something real. "Remember, Clara," he said, "true beauty is in its depths, where there is pain, where there are scars, and when you learn to see this beauty, you will be able to show it to the world." She was drawn to his words and began to believe that he was right. She felt both empowered and enslaved by his lessons, as if her life had become deeper, but also more complex. And with each new encounter, she was drawn even more into this world, despite the anxious inner voice that warned her of the danger. That evening, Clara came to Harold's house with a trembling in her chest, not knowing what exactly had brought her here. In recent days, her thoughts had been circling around him, and she felt that she could no longer ignore this attraction. Their conversations, which had once been simple and calm, were becoming increasingly confusing. Clara saw something in him that fascinated and frightened her at the same time. Her heart was tight with anxiety, but her eyes were filled with curiosity, a desire to understand and perhaps heal this person who had become much more important to her than she had ever imagined. Clara sat down next to him, and they looked at each other in silence as dusk slowly fell on the town. Her eyes caught every wrinkle in his face, every little detail that told of the pain and burden of his past. She touched his arm, and he did not push her away, but seemed to crave this touch, as an escape from the silence that surrounded him. "I want to understand you, Harold," she whispered softly, looking into his dark eyes. "I want to help you let go of what has been tormenting you for so long." Harold remained silent, but his gaze grew closer and more intense. She saw his eyes fill with something inexplicable, almost obsessive. He reached out and touched her face as if he didn't believe she was real. Her fingers ran softly over his cheeks, and she felt him shudder at the touch. At that moment, they were the only people in the whole world, and everything around them disappeared. They sat there holding hands, feeling each other's warmth. For Clara, this moment was special because it was the first time she had ever opened up so completely, feeling that her desire to understand and heal him could turn into something more. Her heart beat faster as she realized that she felt not just friendly warmth for him, but a real attraction that straddled the line between fear and admiration. "You're the only one who understands," he whispered, his voice deep and husky. "The only one who sees me as more than just a lonely old man." For a moment, Clara felt her own words, her feelings, begin to control her. She wanted him to know that he was important to her, that she was willing to do anything to free him from the pain that haunted him. Each subsequent meeting took on new shades. Their relationship became more and more open and intimate. She noticed Harold opening up to her more and more, pretending it was just a conversation, but she could see his eyes seeking her approval, her attention. She was the only thread that connected him to reality. His voice changed when he spoke to her, becoming softer and more trusting. Deep down, Clara felt that she was playing with fire, but that fire was drawing her closer every day. She began to believe that she could change him, heal his wounds, even if her intuition told her to be careful. She was drawn to him as if to an abyss, where she could find something much more than just friendship. This turn of events seemed almost unbelievable to Harold. He would never have imagined that a young girl could not only be interested in him, but also see something more in him. He began to perceive her as a savior, as someone who could pull him out of the shadows in which he had spent most of his life. For him, Clara became the only light in the darkness, and this feeling was beginning to turn into an obsession. He craved her presence, her understanding. His own feelings were getting stronger and stronger, and he couldn't help but want to see her every day. Her face, her voice, her caring glances became a necessity for him, like air. Clara filled the emptiness he had been carrying around since the loss of his family, and now he could no longer imagine his life without her. Harold began to lose control. He realized that he was becoming dependent on her, that his desire to have her attention and care was turning into a need, and it was starting to scare him. But at the same time, he couldn't stop. Her words that she wanted to heal him were not just a promise to him. They were the last hope that kept him alive in this world. Clara could feel his need for her growing. She could see his eyes becoming intense, his eyes filled with not only gratitude, but also anxiety, almost obsession. But she did not back down. Her own desire to save him overshadowed her fear, and she felt that she wanted to stay close to him, no matter what the cost. She believed that she could give him what he needed, a sense of peace, comfort, understanding. She felt an inescapable desire to become a part of his life, even if it seemed dangerous. Harold became not only her friend, but also a riddle that she could not solve, but desperately wanted to solve. "You make me feel like I'm living again," he said once, looking at her with a look that made her heart beat faster. Clara listened quietly to his words, feeling mixed emotions, fear and hope, desire and anxiety. She realized that she had gone too far, but she couldn't back away. Her heart beat in unison with his words, with his eyes, and she knew that this connection was not just temporary. It had become a part of her life. Their meetings became filled not only with conversations, but also with long silences that spoke more than words. They touched each other, as if trying to calm their souls, to fill themselves with the warmth they both lacked. Clara believed that her love and understanding could heal him, that she would be the one to break his dark connection to the past. But at the same time, deep down, she felt that this path could have dangerous consequences. Harold was becoming not just a person to her, but a part of her life that she could no longer imagine without him. And although her own heart was trembling with doubt, she went ahead, believing that her feelings were stronger than any fears. The sun was already disappearing behind the horizon as Clara walked down the street to her friend Emma's house. She had been invited to meet some friends and decided to accept the invitation. In recent months, she had withdrawn from her peers, completely immersed in the world Harold had opened up for her. However, sometimes she felt that she missed the familiarity of socializing, simple conversations that could distract her from the emotional burden she was carrying because of her complicated relationship with Harold. Clara entered Emma's house, where several friends had already gathered. The atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter and conversation. She was greeted with cheers and shouts of greeting, and she felt like a part of normal life again, without the heavy shadow of the past, as she had with Harold. She allowed herself to relax, laugh, and enjoy herself, even though thoughts of him still lingered in her mind. Meanwhile, Harold sat in his dark room, waiting for Clara, as he always did on such evenings. His anxiety was growing, the clock was ticking, and every second was like a hammer blow to him. He knew that Clara had gone to her friends, and this thought haunted him. Jealousy flooded him like poison, making him imagine her with her peers, with young boys who could give her something he could never have. His obsession with her presence and attention turned into an unhealthy need that he could no longer control. Why is she there? Why isn't she here next to me? This thought tore him apart from the inside. It seemed to him that her every laugh, every look she gave to others was moving her away from him. His fear of losing the only person who accepted him, who was not afraid of his dark past, was beginning to fill him from the inside. Clara sat with her friends, listening to the stories of Emma and the others. One of the boys, Liam, had always been fond of her, and was now trying to get her attention by joking and asking her to dance. She cheerfully got up and allowed herself to dance with him for a while, laughing at his jokes. But even as she danced, she felt that part of her thoughts were with Harold, and this internal conflict was tearing her apart from the inside. Emma noticed that Clara was distant and asked her, "Clara, you've changed somehow lately. We've all noticed. Is everything okay with you?" Clara thought for a moment, searching for words. She couldn't tell them about Harold, about their encounters and his troubled past. She only answered briefly, "Yes, everything is fine. It's just that something important has come into my life. Something that makes me look at everything differently." Her friends didn't understand, but accepted this explanation. They went back to their conversations, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She felt a strange sense of anxiety, as if she shouldn't be here, but should go back to Harold so that he wouldn't feel abandoned. She was drawn to the exit, and after saying goodbye, she left her friends and went out into the darkness. Clara walked down the street, breathing in the cool night air. Her heart was beating fast, and she mentally promised herself that next time she would tell Harold how she felt about him, what he meant to her. She wanted to give him the assurance that she would always be there for him, even through all his fears. But her path was blocked by a dark figure. Harold appeared in front of her, his face contorted with rage and pain. "Were you with them?" His voice was low, but it was so powerful that she felt afraid. Clara took a step back in confusion, tried to explain. "Harold, they are just my friends, nothing more. You know they don't mean as much to me as you do." But her words seemed hollow and false to him. He saw only betrayal, felt that she had divided her attention and care with others, and it was destroying him from the inside. "You promised to be there for me, Clara, and instead you're off playing with boys who are worthless." His voice was shaking with emotions he could no longer control. "Harold, calm down. It's just a party. I came back to you because—" Her voice trailed off when she saw his eyes, which were not only jealous but also something much more dangerous. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Harold grabbed her by the shoulders, and his hands were like iron shackles, holding her trapped. Clara could feel the air leaving her lungs, and his face became blurred. Her voice was not enough to stop him, and her last attempt to escape was not to be. In that moment, all of his fears, pain, and obsession exploded, and Harold, without realizing his actions, crossed a line that neither of them should ever have crossed. His hands, which had once been her protection and support, became the instrument that took her life. Darkness enveloped her, and she sank to the ground. Harold stood in complete silence, staring at her motionless body, gradually realizing what he had done. Reality hit him like a wave breaking a rock, and he fell to his knees, clutching his head. He had lost everything that was important to him, everything that had given meaning to his life in recent months. His obsession, his morbid need to have her attention, had led him to disaster. Left alone in the darkness, he felt the silence pressing down on him, enveloping him in coldness. Clara was the only person who could understand him, and now she was gone. The town was enveloped in an atmosphere of fear and mourning as the news of Clara's death spread quickly among the residents. Her family was devastated. Her friends were shocked and frightened. For many, this event remained a mystery. Clara, always dreamy and kind, had no enemies, and no one could imagine that she could have been the victim of a brutal crime. So detectives from the neighboring county came to the town to find out the truth. Detectives Grayson and Brooks were experienced investigators who had solved complex cases before. They had a calm and systematic approach to investigating, and this case was no exception. They both realized that the pitfall of the case was that Clara had no conflicts or visible problems in her relationships with others. Her death seemed like a senseless tragedy, but their experience suggested that there must be something more to it. The detectives began by examining the crime scene. Clara's body was lying on the grass in a small park on the outskirts of the town. It was immediately apparent that she had not actively resisted, but there were marks on her shoulders and arms from a strong squeeze. The marks on the ground indicated a brief struggle, but there was nothing to suggest that the attack was random. After examining the body, detectives noticed the absence of a camera, an item Clara always carried with her. Her passion for photography was known among her friends and acquaintances, so the disappearance of the camera could point to possible important evidence. It was hoped that the camera, if found, might contain clues about her last moments, or even a hint of who might have been around that night. Detectives went to the Jones home to speak with Clara's family. Her parents looked devastated, and her younger brother was unable to speak at all from grief. Mrs. Jones said that Clara had recently been spending a lot of time alone or walking on the outskirts of town, looking for inspiration for her photographs. She was very passionate about photography, her mother said quietly. Lately, she'd been saying she'd found special subjects to shoot. We didn't even know what she was talking about, but she seemed happy. Clara's friends told us that she was at a party the night the tragedy happened. Liam, one of her close friends, said that Clara left the party earlier than the others and walked home alone. She seemed happy, but there was a certain detachment in her behavior. She seemed different lately, added Emma, her best friend. You know, like her mind was somewhere else. She's been thinking a lot and not even telling me how she really feels. She became mysterious. During the investigation, the detectives learned that Clara had recently been in contact with a lonely man, Harold Walker, who lived on the outskirts of the town. This aroused their curiosity, because Harold was an older recluse who hardly ever talked to his neighbors. Only a few locals knew about his past, and they said that he was a former military man who had lost his family and had since closed himself off from the world. The detectives decided to talk to Harold. He opened the door reluctantly, and although his gaze remained calm, the detectives noticed something disturbing in his demeanor. He seemed to be prepared for the police to come, but showed no fear or embarrassment. "Did you know Clara Jones?" asked Detective Grayson, watching his reaction closely. "Yes," Harold replied, looking down. "We talked sometimes. She was a special girl, saw the world in a way that others couldn't." His voice sounded restrained, but there was an emotion in his eyes that the detectives couldn't help but notice. Walker said that they talked about art and photography, and that she often came to him to discuss her ideas. "But we were just friends," he added, seeming to want to assure the detectives of his innocence. The detectives asked him if he had seen her that evening, and Harold, holding his breath, replied that he had last seen her a few days ago. He looked disturbed, and the detectives felt that he was not telling them something. They decided to keep him under surveillance, feeling that the story might have a sequel. The detectives returned to the crime scene to examine it again and look for possible details that could help solve the case. After a thorough examination, they found something unusual: a small, barely noticeable pendant that could have belonged to Clara. It was an item that she might have accidentally dropped during the fight. The pendant was kept as evidence, hoping that it might help uncover new details. Detectives also began looking for witnesses who might have seen Clara the night she died. One of the local residents recalled seeing her with a camera near the old station on the outskirts, but this was a few days before the tragedy. A man who worked the night shift near the park said he saw the silhouette of a man standing on the edge of the park that night, but he did not recognize the face. This only added to the mystery, as it is not known whether the man was involved in the crime or just a bystander. Clara was a symbol of light and peace for many, and it was still unclear why anyone would want her dead. The detectives analyzed her personality, trying to understand if there might have been a dark side to her life that she had hidden from others. "We have to find a motive," Detective Grayson told his partner. "That's the key to understanding why this happened." They considered various theories: the possibility of a random attack, a dispute with someone, or even a romantic liaison that could have ended in tragedy. However, all these theories did not match the reality described by her friends and family. The detectives realized that there was more to the case than meets the eye. An unknown man, the absence of a camera, hints that Clara had communicated with people who could have influenced her worldview. All of this pointed to a complex chain of events that could have led to the tragedy. The next step for the detectives was to find the camera to understand what shots could have been taken that last evening. They felt that this camera was a key piece of evidence that could help uncover the truth about that fateful evening. Detectives Grayson and Brooks worked hard on the investigation, collecting all the evidence and clues that could shed light on Clara's tragic death. Their main goal was to find the missing camera, as they suspected it might have captured important moments from that night. After several days of intense searching, they received important information. One of the local hunters accidentally came across an old camera among the dense bushes near the park where Clara's body was found. The camera was damaged, but the film remained intact. Detectives quickly sent it for examination, hoping to find the necessary evidence. When the photos were printed out, the detectives looked at each frame with excitement. Clara had taken pictures of ordinary things, that night lamps in the park, trees, but one shot stood out. It showed Harold walking behind her, his face barely visible but enough to recognize him. This shot became the key piece of evidence that confirmed Harold's presence with Clara that fateful night. Grayson and Brooks went to Harold's house with a search warrant, and their instincts were right. In the basement, they found Clara's pendant, her favorite piece of jewelry that she always had with her. This discovery was the final nail in the case. Harold could not justify what he had found. His hands were shaking and his eyes were intense and focused. He tried to justify his presence by saying that he was just keeping an eye on her to make sure she was okay. However, investigators knew that this was not enough to explain the pendant found and his behavior. Under the pressure of the evidence, Harold eventually broke down. With despair in his eyes, he confessed to the crime, explaining that his jealousy of Clara had clouded his judgment. He was convinced that she was cheating on him by communicating with her peers, and that night, seized with rage, he could not control himself. His obsession and fear of losing the only person who understood him pushed him to commit the crime. "I never wanted it to end like this," he said quietly. "She was everything to me. And at one point I felt I couldn't control myself anymore." Harold was arrested, and the case was brought to court. In the town, the news shook everyone who knew Clara or Harold. The trial became the centerpiece of the town's events. People came to learn the details and hear the sentence of the man who had killed Clara. At the trial, the lawyers tried to portray Harold as a man who suffered from psychological problems due to his tragic past and loneliness. They argued that he was emotionally vulnerable and could not cope with his feelings. However, the prosecutor presented all the evidence he had gathered, including photographs, the pendant, and Harold's confession. He showed that Harold's obsession and jealousy had developed into a dangerous need to possess Clara, which led to her death. The verdict was inevitable. The court found Harold guilty of Clara's murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and although many in the room hoped for a fair punishment, no one felt happy or relieved. Clara's parents were left with unspeakable pain, and nothing could bring back their loss. The town will long remember Clara, a young, talented girl whose life was tragically cut short by a morbid obsession and a dangerous desire for control. Her friends and family often talked about her bright dreams, and the photographs that remained as a memory of a young soul who tried to find beauty in every moment. Detectives Grayson and Brooks discussed the case as they wrapped up, knowing that obsession and jealousy are not always immediately apparent. Sometimes they grow, hidden deep within the soul, just waiting for the moment when they come to the surface and destroy everything around them.